We thought we would break out the comfy chairs and do a little bit of a conversation with some state leaders who have been doing an enormous amount of work in their states. I think the balance of the kinds of conversations that we wanted to have at an event like this was to talk about what's possible, to talk about what's hard, and to talk about things that have actually gotten done. And the folks that are sitting here with me this afternoon are going to try to talk about all of those things. I'll tell you a little bit about the work that has been going on in their respective states, but we're going to try to draw out throughout the conversation some of the lessons learned about how it is that one sort of cultivates, manages, and sustains significant juvenile justice reform in each of your jurisdictions. And so what I'm going to do is actually turn to each of our panelists and introduce them in turn, but also ask them to speak to sort of the first part of the question, which was when you had a few moments to talk to the policymakers in your state, when you had just like to essentialize what was the crisis in your state, what was the thing that was going on in your state, or what was the state of affairs that had really gotten you to a place of really thinking about significant criminal justice reform, to try to give each of you a sense of where these different states are at and the kind of work that they've been doing. And so the first person that I'm going to turn to is Dr. Stephen Philippi from the Institute of Public Health and Justice at the LSU Health Sciences Center. And maybe you could just kind of give us a little bit of a sense of where your state was at and kind of like the moment that we were able to crystallize around a mission or around action.
Excellent, thank you. Thanks for having us. Where the state currently is at, is Alabama in the room?
Yeah.
They're loud and proud and right there.
We were undefeated just until 2 days ago. Thank you very much. So I work for LSU. Well, I appreciate y'all having me anyway. The one thing that I would say to Alabama and the rest, we are ranked second though in the number of EBPs per capita in Louisiana, and we actually got on that map out of nowhere. That's where we've garnered probably the most attention nationally, is how did we move from not even being on the list of evidence-based practice providers to one that's ranked second nationally per capita. And the things that spawned a lot of that certainly was a whole lot of great leadership, some of which are in the room. Simone Gonsolin was there as we started to downsize the correctional facilities under a consent decree. Mary Livers has been there since we've released so many of those kids into the community, and the question was, what do we do with them? So one big lesson learned in terms of the status of things is turning crisis into opportunity. We went from a lawsuit to 3 very substantial hurricanes, wiping out a lot of services for us, to a recession that largely made it an issue not so much of not just what is the right thing to do for these kids, but what can we afford, and we couldn't afford to waste a penny anymore. So making sure that we had research-driven services behind these kids. And the last thing I would just say about that has a lot to do with MacArthur and what MacArthur did in terms of supporting us to do that. The research on diffusion of research-driven practices is a new ballgame. You could ask 10 professors what they think. You've got a lot of students at LSU very grateful that I'm here because they don't have to hear about it today for 3 hours. But how do you actually grow practices in a reasonable amount of time to reach the kids that need them? And right now the science says it takes about 30 years, which is way too long to wait. So we're constantly backing that up and trying to figure out how can we get the services to these kids that need them. And that's what MacArthur really funded in Louisiana, which is the science of diffusion. How do we do this? How do we get groups together and help them to strategize and then move those strategies into real practice without funding one service? MacArthur did not come in and fund services. They funded the strategy at which we were going to get those services out to the community.
Okay, we're going to follow up on that piece because I think that's really an interesting one. So you had a natural disaster, you had a recession, and you had a lawsuit, not necessarily in that order.
Yes, and we lost to Alabama.
All
so.
right. And I thought that was under natural disaster.
Yes.
Okay.
Very much.
But and everyone here in the States, I think, can think about at least one of those things going wrong in their states, maybe not the combination of all 3, if not 4 of those things. But Judge Fox, can you talk a little bit about Georgia and sort of the thing that brought you to consciousness around, like the state to consciousness around this being really a priority issue?
Sure, so thank you, and thank you all for the opportunity to be with you today. Georgia
in 2011 established the Special Counsel on Criminal Justice Reform. Governor Deal established that council to predominantly affect criminal justice reform in the adult arena. And so the second year of that, in 2012, for the 2013 session, we began looking at our juvenile justice data in a couple of perspectives. Predominantly from a fiscal perspective, but also from the moral perspective and the moral imperatives inherent in all of the criminal justice reform of our governor. And we found some really interesting things. First, that Georgia's juvenile justice budget at that time was roughly $300 million. We were spending 2/3 of that, almost $200 million of it, for out-of-home placements. The cost of a bed per year in one of our secure out-of-home placements in Georgia at that time, and still, is roughly $90,000 per year for one bed. I'm sure some of you are experiencing similar numbers. We also discovered, based on this data analysis, that approximately 65% of the youth that were leaving the most secure facilities were reoffending within 3 years. So really high cost, really poor public safety returns on that investment. And then when you dealt with peeling back that a little bit further, you realize that a large number of the youth that were in these out-of-home placement were low risk based on validated instruments, and they were also there as misdemeanants and status offenders. And so we started looking at just the moral aspect of that, coupled with, we had just roughly in 2011, come out from under, like Louisiana and other states, a federal consent order relative to conditions of confinement cases that had been filed against our department. And then the recession, like in Georgia, like every other state, really brought, I think, all of the players to the table. We built on the council on the political capital that had been gained in our adult reforms the year before, and rolled that into a review of our juvenile justice data, and then let that data inform our policy decisions going forward.
Mm-hmm. And I think there are probably a few folks in the room who are curious to hear that somebody who's the head of the Georgia Court of Appeals is involved in this. And can you talk a little bit about how you sort of got involved in the reentry aspect of this, or in sort of the reentry council itself? And
Sure. So I was formerly, in my prior life, a trial court judge in a 6-county judicial circuit dealing largely with felony population. I did not deal with juveniles unless they had been charged with an offense that was adjudicated in my court. And during that process, became acutely aware of the prevalence of substance abuse and mental health issues and how those were driving, of course, funneling all of these cases into the judicial system. I established an adult felony accountability court, drug court, where I started trying to take a look at drivers and understanding and accepting that the judiciary has a role, I think, in improving the judicial system, not only for the sake of the judicial system, but primarily for the sake of the people that find themselves caught up in that system. And so I started that program, was fortunate enough to be appointed to the Governor's Council the first year that council started, and then with my good friend Thomas Worthy, he and I have co-chaired that council for the last 5 years now. And so I think the judiciary has a role. I heard the judge this morning speaking of the fact that judges had somewhat been left out of the conversation about criminal justice reform. And I think it would be a complete and utter waste of time to leave any stakeholder out. There are so many people that are integrally involved in the judicial system that are stakeholders in the system, and you've got to have buy-in from all of them. This concept of criminal justice reform generally, I think, will not work without buy-in from all of those folks. And so that was the process of Georgia, was to be inclusive and collaborative in our efforts, which naturally included the judiciary.
Fantastic. And so going from 2 lawsuits over to General Counsel for Jim Seward, who is General Counsel for the Governor's Office of South Dakota. Can you talk a little bit about what happened in South Dakota?
Certainly, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. In 2011, South Dakota had a new governor, and I was lucky enough to come in as General Counsel, and I was not planning to work on criminal justice issues at all. We were looking at my job in terms of helping to manage the state's litigation, helping to deal with risk management, and as part of that, somehow I got the task of overseeing Department of Corrections. Soon after that, we realized that we had come in to run a state that had a women's prison that was near capacity, and looking at our good friends in Georgia and Texas, we talked to Pew Charitable Trusts, and they helped bring in the Crime and Justice Institute out of Boston, and we had what was a very successful criminal justice reform of the adults. That process through 2012 and 2013 building on the success of that, because the entire time we were doing the adults, people kept wanting to work on the juvenile system, and we had to say, hold on, hold on. We wanted to do the juvenile system the next year like Georgia was able to do, but neither the folks that were helping us nor our great state employees that were trying to implement the sweeping adult reforms were ready. So we took a year off and we started to look at what was going on in our juvenile system. We were, you don't hear South Dakota very often as the #1 state in anything, right? Well, a couple things. U.S. News and World Report has said many times we're #1 for business, but we weren't dealing with that. We have Mount Rushmore, so we're #1 for that. But we were also, we had been #1 in the juvenile incarceration rate. In 2011, we were determined to be #2, and I'm proud to say that we were just made #1 again. So, not proud because our reforms haven't kicked in yet. But when we dug into that, we figured out the reason for that is because former governors and legislators had taken all the tools and money away from the judicial system. So if somebody's kid was struggling with marijuana, they need to be locked up for a year at the cost of $100,000 a year to deal with that marijuana issue, because we had no evidence-based treatment in the community. We had it in the system. As we started to look at the data, we found that about 75% of our kids that were incarcerated were there for low-level misdemeanors and status offenses. Having been one of those low-level misdemeanors when I was a youth and got a diversion program, I was very fond of that concept, and we marched forward with that.
Fantastic. And then let's talk a little bit more about a state that has probably even a longer history of doing this kind of reform. It's Gabrielle Celeste, who's the director of the Child Policy at Case Western Reserve at University of Ohio. So can you talk a little bit, you've got a longer trajectory that you're working from, and so you know, when we were talking before we started today, you're like, there wasn't a crisis of the moment. You know, we didn't have a flood, we didn't have a lawsuit. You know, I mean, there's been a lot of things. There's been a lawsuit, but can you talk a little bit about sort of what the longer lens for the state of Ohio looks like?
Sure, and first I just want to acknowledge, coming from the state of Ohio, the Buckeye State, you know, we are strong in that way, but I am from Cleveland, so the Browns kind of, you know, even it out just a little bit. But
I just heard a aw from
Thank you. But I would echo all of my colleagues up here, really, in what you all have shared thus far, and particularly this notion of crisis as opportunity, because even so we have, I think, the track record with Reclaim Ohio, which I hope many of you have heard of at this point, and we'll share a bit more, but Reclaim really came about in crisis. You know, 20-some years ago, the early 90s, Ohio had 4 of the 20 top overcrowded facilities in the country. We were at 180% capacity, kids in our juvenile prisons. We had thousands and thousands of young people locked up in these facilities and no real plan or idea about what we were going to do. And it really took partnership. And at the time, the governor at the time, Governor Voinovich, and his lieutenant governor, Mike DeWine, who's our attorney general right now, created a task force and worked with local judges and with local partners to try and come up with what would be a model that makes sense to really address was a crisis in terms of our young people locked up in these facilities. And from that came Reclaim. And Reclaim went statewide 20 years ago this year. And I think one of the lessons that we've learned from this is you needed to sort of build the ground. There were no local options available. So the only real options available to our jurists was to, you know, send the kids away. And frankly, they didn't have to pay for them, so they didn't have to think about it. So in creating a model that actually built incentives for local jurisdictions to keep their young people locally and build programs and build the capacity of providers to work with kids in those communities, that's what really sort of built the groundwork on which so much of the Reclaim work has really evolved since then. So, you know, you said earlier, what would be an elevator speech, you know, that we bring before our representatives? Well, you know, sort of fast forward, and there have been folks in Ohio. Justice Stratton has been a big part of this work. And certainly our House and Senate leadership and our current governor, when we approached the legislature a few years ago to talk about how we kind of advance some of the Reclaim work and invest more in what works, we used the kind of the crisis in the budget, you know, which is what we had at the time, and many states face that. you're spending over $500 a day to place a young person in a facility where the recidivism rates, to your point, Judge Boggs, were significantly higher than the community programs. And we had research, thanks to the MacArthur Foundation's Models for Change and others, that could demonstrate, and programs that showed lower recidivism, lower cost, you invest in what works, and better outcomes for our young people. So it was sort of common sense for our legislators to choose to continue to invest that way.
That's fantastic. So let's talk about, so you've got the ear of your legislators and your leaders, and you're trying to make your case. You're talking about the data that drives the decision-making piece. Did you have everything you needed, or were you missing some stuff? Or talk a little bit about sort of how you tried to tell the lived experience of the kids in your state through data.
So one of the things that I would say, going back to your earlier point, is I didn't do it. One of the things that we knew about data was I would be the shot messenger very quickly. So there are people in the room like Judge Cook who can speak to judges and they'll listen to her. I just need to give her the information on the evidence-based practices, the data outcomes, and make it actually usable. We partnered with DAs. I don't know if there's any district attorneys in the room, but our DAs were some of our largest. They supported us in a huge way in terms of diversion, in terms of our screening and assessment, and they're the gatekeeper. They determined that we talked earlier about informal versus formal processing, and the DAs decide that very quickly. So having them on board, talking to each other about evidence-based practices and not me. Same thing with public defense. Public defense, surprisingly enough, were some of our biggest pushback on this, because having a kid, you can do the numbers real quick, have a kid do probation for 6 months with some supervision versus putting them in an intensive treatment program that they may screw up and they're under a whole lot of scrutiny. Sometimes the public defenders were opting to go the opposite direction and say, just do your time. So bringing a lot of people to the table to understand what research-driven practices were, what research-driven screening assessment actually does and does not do was important, and then having those professional groups speak to each other. And it didn't all come from the university or MacArthur or somebody outside, but we had true champions being built up inside the system.
And so once you taught them to ask for evidence and to ask for data, were you able to paint the whole picture for them?
We got close. So once we had these partnerships, we certainly were able to get more data, which is fantastic. And we did two probably very significant things with those data. One is we did a mapping process, and a lot of this is described on the Models for Change website. You can pull down a lot of these briefs and toolkits. But mapping, just who are these kids and where are they ending up in the system, from the point of arrest all the way through the system. So you could actually watch the movement of kids and where were they building up. Looking at data from screening and assessment, what were the actual needs of these kids? So one size, it's been said more than once today already, one size evidence-based practice does not fit all. So what are the actual needs? We're matching programs to those needs. And then we also surveyed our providers. We did a lot of work in garnering information from our providers. What do you do? Who do you do it with? Is it research-driven? What are your outcomes? Who pays for that? So we gathered a lot of information there, and that's been actually one of the success things that we've been able to sustain, is we went from literally about 1 in 10 chance of a juvenile justice youth being referred to something that, at least in name recognition, was an evidence-based practice, to almost 50% at this point. So the utilization and the providers acknowledging that they're doing more research-driven practices was huge.
Cool, and we're going to talk more about that with sustainability. Again, I think that's keeping everybody engaged and involved. Judge, how did you guys tell the story with data, and what did you have and what were you missing?
Yeah, well, the common thread that's run through everything I've listened to this morning and all of the other states that I've been in is data, right? The whole concept of allowing your data, not another state's data, to drive not only informing the policy, but informing the policy makers and determining the breadth and scope of your project. We were fortunate that the public safety, the folks at the Public Safety Performance Project at Pew came down and provided technical assistance. And heretofore, having been a former member of the legislature, I can tell you that at least in my own personal experience, having that objectivity, that political cover, if you will, of someone coming in and giving you your data in a very comprehensive and a thoughtful and deliberate message was very helpful. It was not rhetoric driven, it was not policy driven or politically driven, it was not partisan. Everything we've passed in Georgia in a legislature that's got 236 members has passed unanimously. It's passed unanimously in the House and Senate. And it's because of the extraordinary leadership of our governor, Nathan Deal, but it's also because the fiscal imperative, I think, got everybody to the table. They realized that the numbers were simply not sustainable. They weren't sustainable in any form or fashion to be able to tell the taxpayers of the state of Georgia that for this $300 million investment, a 65% recidivism rate is simply unacceptable. There is clearly a better way to do it, but we had not thought about, no one had ever brought up the concept of evidence-based practices. And we had never really looked at our data enough to determine what was it actually telling us relative to public safety. Because public safety was the paramount concern, as it should be, in any efforts to remediate a criminal justice system, whether it's in the adult system or the juvenile system. So for us, everybody got to the table as a result, I think, of the fiscal imperative, but Pew was able to bring some objectivity to the numbers. And it was no longer Democrats wanting to do this and Republicans wanting to do this and trying to find out where the middle ground was. The message really resonated once we had the objectivity. And so for Georgia, that's what got us, I think, to the next level. Plus we did, I think, a very strategic thing in that we folded out the juvenile piece after we did the adult piece. And the adult piece was, quite frankly, a little easier. And the numbers in the adult piece were even more egregious. More money was involved in our adult. We have a $1.1 billion corrections budget in Georgia, and for that got a 33% recidivism rate or return on that investment. And so once we established that as the groundwork or the framework for the dialogue, it was intuitive that the next year, once we started having that same dialogue about our data and the poor public safety returns on investment in the juvenile arena, everybody was already kind of on board and in tune with how that would form itself and inform our public policy.
And so when you're looking at it now, so everyone kind of, the pump was sort of primed with the adult process and then the juvenile process, which is something that you had said in your states as well.
Right.
But also then, is there something that you still wish you could see? Is there a metric, or, and come back to you if you want to think on it, but is there something that you're still thinking, it would really help us continue to propel our work if we were able to track and to know?
Yeah, I mean, data is still the problem. It was the problem going in, it's still the problem, it's going to continue to be the problem. What we've talked about this morning, whether or not the evidence-based practices are actually going to move the public safety needle. That's the $64 million question. In Georgia, it was an $85 million question. And ultimately, it boils down to the fidelity of the implementation of those particular practices. Georgia has 159 counties. One of our largest concerns was, how do you roll out effective evidence-based programming in 159 counties? Ohio has 88 counties, if I recall correctly. It's difficult to do. The disparate resources that are available in metropolitan and urban parts of a state, like Georgia, are really difficult. And so the data that is going to help inform the future policymakers relative to this is going to need to be much deeper on recidivism. I don't know that we ought to always be looking just at a 3-year reconviction rate. I'm not sure we ought not be looking at risk-based recidivism, so we get a bigger picture and a better picture of who it is that is creating the problem, so that we can drive resources and policies to effectuate those folks. So it's a very complicated process. I think it's always going to be heavily data-driven. I don't speak for everyone in our state. We don't have all the data we need. I don't know that we ever will, because the disparate management information systems in 159 counties, with Georgia, unlike other states, I suppose, we have dependent and independent courts. Everyone's not using the same information, and we'll talk later about how we're dealing with that, but they're huge challenges.
So let's talk about the data issue for your state. And you have also very rural areas of the state, so even taking it more for how all of this information gets collected in areas that are more geographically remote. And so how are you guys managing through data, and what's the challenges that still sit in front of you?
Well, South Dakota has rural, and then we have frontier.
Yeah.
Actually, I think some of our area is federally defined as frontier country, and when you can drive 100 miles without finding a fuel station or a courthouse, that's probably frontier. Judge Boggs is absolutely right. The data was key. Having Pew and CJI come in and assist us was key. I used to be a DA, and so I was somewhat skeptical when I got started in this, and I had about 100 friends in the state that were very skeptical. And you know, one of the things that was very helpful, and it took me a while to figure this out because I'm not a data guy. I wasn't born and raised a data guy. Pew doesn't just come in or CSG or any of those groups and say, okay, we looked at your numbers, here's your data, here's your numbers. They give it back to the agencies. My friends here from DSS and DOC get a chance to look at what they say the numbers show, and they get to analyze that. And so when you're sitting down with the DAs or those other groups, you can say, you know, this just isn't a Pew number, this is a South Dakota number. This is our data, and it was the real key. Like I said, we were second in the nation for juvenile incarceration rate. 75% of our kids were misdemeanants and status violators. We had seen a decrease in our incarceration rate, but the length of stay had gone up 27%, and the number of kids going into probation had come down 24%. So everything we looked at just looked like we were headed the wrong direction. That data was key to get everybody in the room, nonpartisan manner. You know, if you sit down around the kitchen table and you look at your budget, if you can get everybody to agree on what the numbers are. Now, usually we won't all agree on what we ought to do with it if there's a surplus, right? But if you can agree on what the numbers are, this is an honest number, then it's easier later on to agree on different ways to fix that.
Mm-hmm. And how did you have some of the same challenges that Georgia had, where, you know, I mean, lots of different jurisdictions, lots of different data systems. How did you work through some of those things to put together that portrait? We
do not have independent courts, whatever that is. I'll look forward to hearing about that tonight. But we have a lot of independent folks, and we don't have county probation. So it's all state probation. Department of Corrections takes care of the juvenile kids that are incarcerated. So our data was pretty good. We had to do some information sharing that we learned about on the adult side. We figured out that our state court system and our Department of Corrections, our computers weren't talking very well, but we got that fixed. And so when we went to the juvenile side, it was much easier to work on those tough data questions.
Mm-hmm. And everybody was a little more willing perhaps at that point, or?
You know, at this point, the governor likes to say when they see Jim Seward coming, they go across the street. So I don't know if they were more willing, but, and some of our folks that are here from the agencies today would agree with that they're probably getting tired of me showing up with a pew in hand and working on another issue. But you know, I think people saw the success that we could have, from legislators to judges. After we went through that first process, people would say, you know, this really is how government should work. We should try to get Washington to do some work like this. Mm-hmm. And so all of us in the states are excited to see that there are some things going on in Washington where you can get folks from both sides of the aisle to sit down, study a problem, mm-hmm. come up with a solution.
And so, obviously, with a longer-standing program in Ohio, you have all the data you need, right? And it's just been an uninterrupted joy of
yes.
Of
no, unfortunately, we don't. And you know, I know we were going to talk about challenges later. The state actually has quite a bit of data, and that's a good thing. But when it comes to our local jurisdictions, and we are a home rule state, which means 88 counties, 88 courts, 88 administrations, we have some real challenges around data. However, I will say. You know, the whole, the work that's grown out of Reclaim has gone hand in hand with data collection and evaluation. And you all had the pleasure of the treasure we have in Ohio with Dr. Latessa at the University of Cincinnati. And so they have been studying and evaluating Reclaim since its inception. And as a result, we have very rich data that tells us both what's working. So for example, we knew even early on that the recidivism rates for kids who went through Reclaim were at about 15% compared to 40% at our community correctional facilities or 50% at our DYS state facilities. But trying to understand why that was and which kind of kids, you know, again, University of Cincinnati went back and from that work developed our risk assessment tool. So the OYAS, which Dr. Latessa mentioned briefly earlier, has had a huge impact on the work that the state continues to do and the ways in which our department has evolved its programming to really target populations. So from the evaluation and that data, we focus not just on the highest placing counties to really try and reduce admissions at the state level, and we've done that through something called targeted reclaim, which I might get a chance to talk about later. But also looking at the outcome of recidivism, but we're also building in other kinds of outcomes around wellness. So we have something called the Behavioral Health Juvenile Justice program, which was developed in 2005 and has grown as well to look at kids with behavioral health needs. And we see, again, when you compare some of the numbers from the targeted reclaim and BHJJ to sort of regular what kids get in our state facilities, on recidivism, Judge, you'd be happy to know we actually see much, much lower numbers. And the BHJJ, the latest report found that kids coming out of the BHJJ program compared to the same risk level kids in DYS recidivated at 2.2% compared to the 19% the DYS. And our kids coming out of targeted reclaim was something like 5% compared to 15%. So those are real numbers in terms of recidivism, but again, I'd say it's important for our data to look at the wellness kind of outcomes, the positive youth development pieces that we need to be paying attention to as well. And that's where this next round of competitive reclaim is really moving toward. So we can maybe talk a bit about that later too.
Well, I was going to ask you actually, so what is the uncharted territory?
Yeah.
You know, because the problem of having no data is horrible, but the problem of having too much and sort of not being able to see trends
we'll never
is hard
have
too.
too much data.
So you're not there.
Right? Yeah, no.
But what do you think is like the next? It's the area of like other outcomes, obviously.
Right.
So it's adding to recidivism, but what else?
Right. Well, so one of the things we've mentioned evidence-based practices quite a bit, and obviously, so both targeted reclaim and BHJJ require communities and providers to use evidence-based practices, and they select from a menu of services. But we also know that you get innovation through attempting other ways of serving young people. But you don't want to do that in a vacuum. You need data to do that well. So competitive reclaim, this new iteration of reclaim, is really using data and using the OYAS, so you understand risk and the risk principles, to match the intervention with the right kind of, the kid with the right kind of intervention. And so there's 3 kinds of programming that's available through competitive reclaim, one of which doesn't require evidence-based. It requires a promising model and a logic model that explains sort of how you're going to get from point A to point B using the OYAS. And all of these grants, embedded in the grant is a partnership with a university partner. So we heard earlier the importance of fidelity. So not just saying you're going to do what you do, but having support and coaching along the way, which the department really provides through these grants and providing and sort of building the capacity locally through these partnerships. And then in the deeper competitive reclaim programming, we have, for moderate and high-risk youth, they're then required to use the evidence-based kinds of practices. And I'll tell you, I'm really excited because we're now looking, we don't have the data back yet from competitive reclaim, so we don't know yet what it's going to tell us, but we're also now moving to home-based treatment and regionalized home-based treatment through our competitive reclaim model. And I think we're going to see some really, really interesting outcomes with the young people and the families they're working with through this. So reclaim has really evolved in the last 20 years. We still have our bread and butter reclaim and throughout the state in our 88 counties that doesn't, by the way, rely on all of the same kind of data, but we've built from that. And I think we're seeing significant change as a result.
Fantastic. And Doctor, let's talk about like sort of, so you're not as far along in terms of like time spent, but like, sort of what you think of as the greatest successes of the initiative that you've been working on, and then also like what you kind of still see as one of the greatest challenges. It could be data, it could be budget, it could be some other things, but like, can you talk a little bit about sort of the highlights that folks here would sort of be interested in hearing about, but also then what do you think's left to do?
Sure. So, I think some of the highlights, probably one of the bigger take-home messages, is when we looked at other states in terms of how to make this work and actually make it sustainable and build these practices. We combined 2 things. I've heard states that did the top-down measure. Here are the practices you can do. This is what we'll pay for. That's it. And then we've also looked at states that did really more of a bottom-up process. And we've done both. We actually acted more of the intermediary between the locals and the state government, fighting for Medicaid approval of evidence-based practices, definitions, rates, things like that, to keep our providers that were a lot of small, as you look at juvenile justice and who does a lot of the services, you all know a lot of them are small agencies, small organizations, and making the shift that we did in Louisiana to largely a Medicaid-funded system now was huge. And I still have a pipe dream. If anybody wants to fund it, I'll take your money. But I want to track the dollars from the feds all the way down to the kid in Louisiana and see how much of that dollar is left in Medicaid by the time it gets to the kid. Because what we've done is we've created a system at this point that is totally dependent in a large way on that Medicaid dollar. And we've got these small organizations that have had to give up therapist positions, give up counselors, give up case managers in order to hire accountants and to run their books. So I'm worried about that as we continue to grow dependent on that. But as I've looked, I guess go back to the earlier point, is this top-down, bottom-up. We were very focused on being an advocate at the state level, making sure the legislature understood what we were asking for when we were talking about research-driven practices, talking to the child serving agency leadership, and making sure that we were all on the same page about the emphasis on evidence-based practices, but then going into the local community and gathering data there and bringing it back up to the state. So it wasn't a state saying, this is what's going to fix all the juvenile justice issues, but when we go up to Northeast Louisiana, we were able to describe through the data we gathered there, what do those kids need in that area? So really focusing on developing a picture of local needs, and then the sustainability arm of that will be, do we move that needle? Mm-hmm. So if we say the biggest need in Northeast Louisiana, I'm making this up, but I'm sure it's possibly accurate, is substance abuse for youth. If we institute programs for that, do we actually see a drop, not just in juvenile crime, but do we see a drop in those risk areas centered around substance use? Do we see a drop in juvenile substance use? And we're better on the prevention side. If you look at prevention science, they've done a much better job at sustainably following data and showing those decreases. I think it's a very novel and new thing in the juvenile justice arena. But we need to track the data over time and find out, are we, those needs, those risk and need areas like Dr. Latessa talked about, are we actually decreasing those and not just the fact that arrest is down or recidivism's down?
And do you think you have the data foundation to get those outcomes, or is that going to be sort of further road ahead? We're
getting closer. I told you my greatest partner was the DAs. The one big gap we have in our data is the thing that we already mentioned earlier in one of the sessions, which is diversion. And there's as many diversion programs as there are DAs in the state, and there's no data collection or sharing or analysis that I know of. And that's a big next hurdle, because I would love to know what is happening to those kids, and are the diversion measures actually effective.
And Judge, what would you say is your biggest accomplishments of the initiative and sort of the thing that is still looming ahead?
Well, there's not one. We're fortunate, and we have an extraordinary commissioner in Avery Niles, who's here with us today, who really buys into this concept of the fidelity of the evidence-based practices that have been adopted through criminal justice reform. We've done a few things in Georgia. Georgia had, in 1980, a designated felony act for youth that originally only had 11 offenses that, as you might imagine, were the more serious offenses. It morphed over time to 39 offenses. Some of which, as you might imagine, were not as significant as murder and rape and burglary, for example. We went in and stratified that to Class A and Class B designated felonies, removed the mandatory sentence that judges had to impose, and instilled judicial discretion, something that I think most of your judges would appreciate. I know that I did, and having an opportunity to ensure that the judge is able to direct that youth or even an adult in the adult system to the appropriate sentence and appropriate services. We also, a large percentage of our out-of-home placements, up 53%, were there for misdemeanors or status offenses. Those were non-secure out-of-home placements, but 53%. Georgia statutorily enacted a prohibition against sending any status offender to an out-of-home placement, prohibited it in its entirety, and prohibited most of the misdemeanors as well. Of course, the problem when you do that, and we confronted this, which goes to our third piece of the puzzle, was if you're going to divert them from an out-of-home placement, what are you going to do with them? And in 159 counties, that was tough. So the governor allocated roughly $7 million to build community-based programs, incentivizing those programs and saying that your commitment needs to be that you will divert at least 15% of your youth, heretofore previously committed to out-of-home placements, into one of these evidence-based programs that we're going to give you the money to build. And after 9 months in Georgia, and I will preface this comment with this, the money went to 29 grant recipients that represented roughly 70% of Georgia's at-risk youth. So Georgia has 10 million people, metropolitan areas around Atlanta, as you would imagine, and so many of the recipients were in the larger metropolitan areas of the state that represented 70% of the at-risk youth. The commitment to take the legislature's money was a commitment of 15% reduction in out-of-home placements over the first year. We gauged it in 9 months just to get an idea of where we were, and they did not reduce by 15%. Those recipients reduced by 62%. 62% reduction in out-of-home placements. So stratifying the Designated Felony Act and removing mandatory restrictive sentence, out-of-home sentences for judges and instilling some discretion, dealing with the building of, prohibiting status offenders and some misdemeanors from out-of-home placement, building community-based programs, and then lastly, codifying and mandating the use of validated risk and predisposition assessments. So we're informing the court at the appropriate time, at the beginning, how to divert this youth into programs that are more meaningful and more productive in the nature of increasing public safety and giving this youth the services that they need.
Mm-hmm. And what do you think is still the thing that's sitting in front of you?
The data is still a challenge. So in Georgia, we have put in a little over $500,000 into a data exchange program that we've just started, where we will assemble all of the data from these various management information systems across the state into some sort of discernible, we hope, amalgamation of information that can help drive the next step. We still have things to do in the juvenile arena. I think as we talk about evidence-based practices and we talk about fidelity in Georgia, and I know the administrator will be pleased to hear this, but we've hired, with their help, we've hired a third-party agency to do fidelity implementation of our programs, to ensure that we have an objective set of eyes looking at what we're doing to ensure fidelity of these evidence-based practices. The department's not doing it, a third agency's doing it, and so I think for me, the challenge has always been data, and secondarily, the challenge has always been implementation. You all will get technical assistance if you ask for it to build these programs. The key is sustainability requires effective implementation. We use the catchword fidelity all day today, but the key is it's got to be implemented appropriately. You've got to measure it, and you've got to do something with the data that you get. So for us, I think the ongoing challenges in Georgia will be implement these strategies successfully and appropriately with fidelity. Check your work, make sure that it's producing the results we expect, and I would gather that once we've done that, that it will lead us to the next intuitive step of where we go with criminal justice reform policies in Georgia in the future.
So tell me where you're headed.
We're headed to the top of the mountain, Suzanne. You know, it's almost 4:30,
yeah.
And we've only got an hour left before the reception, so I'm going to ask you to hang in there. As a former Army Sergeant, now Lieutenant Colonel, I can see that some of our troops are starting to fade a little bit, and the mission isn't done yet.
No,
so
no.
hang in there. In South Dakota...
Which we'll get to sustainability in a minute.
That's right,
yes.
that's right. We're going to check your sustainability about 10 p.m.
Yes.
And,
we'll be randomly calling rooms, all of that, absolutely.
In South Dakota, we focused on a few key areas, diversion and diversion incentive funding, so that our county prosecutors, when we did our stakeholder meetings around the state, we talked to prosecutors. They were not aware that every county had a diversion program in their county. Did you hear that? That's John 3:6, no. The county prosecutors, who are the gatekeepers to every diversion, did not know that they had a diversion program in every county run through the court system. It's the informal diversion program, the one I benefited from when I was 16 years old and arrested for minor consumption, but I was still eligible to go in the Army because I had informal and didn't need a waiver. Thank goodness. So we got diversion incentive funding in place. we set up presumptive probation so that unless you're convicted of a violent felony or you're a significant risk of harm to another person, the first look is presumptive probation rather than the statistics we saw where we had 75% folks in for drinking alcohol and marijuana costing us $100,000 a year. Interestingly enough, when we went and talked to the moms, which we did, and I say moms because none of the dads ever showed up when we set up meetings of youth offenders. When we talked to the moms, they said, you know, you had my son for a year. He or she came home, they were still smoking marijuana or started the next day. What did you do? You know, we thought we needed to work on that. So made the largest investment in evidence-based treatment in South Dakota. Our Tiffany Wolfgang from DSS is here today. Tiffany, raise your hand because there's people out here. She doesn't want to.
Yeah, I saw a hand go up. Whatever.
I can find her later for you if you want to talk to her. They've moved mountains in the last year to try to get evidence-based practices established in South Dakota in rural parts, in frontier parts, and it's been a monumental task. One of the real keys that we did was performance-based contracting for providers. Happy to share that with you if you're working on that or interested. And then if I could take just a couple more minutes and talk about our Native American population in South Dakota. We've got a great Native American population in South Dakota, about 9% of our state's population, about 29% of our adult criminal justice system. And we learned when we did the adult criminal justice reform that we would tell you if you grew up on a reservation and then ended up in one of our prisons, we would tell you to go to Sioux Falls, which for South Dakota is a metropolitan area, about 200,000 people. That's a metropolitan area, okay? We would kick you out and give you $50 and tell you to go to your job at Taco John's and good luck. And the data showed us that in a few weeks you were back on the reservation. We don't have jurisdiction on the reservation, so that's absconding, and when we catch you off the reservation, you're going to go back to prison. Obviously, that was a big problem in our adult system. We set up what I think is probably the first ever joint state-tribal parole system, supervision, where we help the tribe with money and training, and they pick a parole agent and supervise our folks at home where they want them, and they keep them clean and sober. Last time I checked, which was about 48 hours ago, 97% of the people in that program in the first year have not absconded or violated.
Fantastic.
That's compared to about a recidivism rate of about 50 or 60%. We wanted to do something like that in the juvenile world. The idea just didn't get sparked, and so we set up an 18-month program. It's not a pilot program, but it's a group of folks from our Native American communities and from state government that can work together over the next 18 months, and CJI and others are helping with that, but they're doing kind of an intensive focus group to find out how can we share more information, maybe share resources. If there's a kid in a tribal program that the judge thinks they should come to a state program, maybe we can pay for it. Are there ways we could share jurisdiction? And so that's one of the real key areas in South Dakota, and we're going to be working on that for quite some time. I'll tell you that the implementation, when I first started working in this, I had no idea what implementation, I didn't even know that word existed. In December of 2012, we were drafting the adult bill, and I thought, man, this is so sweet. In about 6 weeks, this is going to pass, get signed by the governor. I am never going to work on this again. I haven't stopped, and I'll tell you, it's the hardest thing I've ever worked on, and I've spent a year in Afghanistan and a couple years in Europe, and I was a ditch digger and a firefighter, and I'll tell you, there's nothing harder than this reform work, and if you're about to get started on that, you're welcome to give me a call, and I'll give you the list of counselors that I deal with.
And as we're getting towards the end of it, that's the thing I really want to ask, and maybe Gabrielle, you can kick us off, is how do you sustain it? We've been talking about the marathon, we've been talking about climbing the mountain, all of those things, but especially from an amazing program that's been around as long as you have, like how do you sustain the interest, sustain the intensity, and that vision for continuing to reform?
Well, I hope we'll continue to sustain it. I mean, one thing is we don't like mandates in Ohio. We probably don't like them anywhere in this country. And I think our leadership has been very creative about really incentivizing accountability in a sense. So I think one of the ways to sustain this work is to have models. It's great to have in-state models, which we now do, of evidence-based programs that other counties can look to build collaboration and partnerships. We have learning communities that our Department of Youth Services leads with the counties that are implementing some of the new starters. When we started a targeted reclaim, the counties, and I think they continue to actually meet quarterly. They share the data, they look at the data, they try and learn from the data. We do that as well in the BHJJ, and now with competitive reclaim. So having a peer community helps to also build, I think, and sustain the work. Incentivizing, continue to find ways to incentivize, to get people to want to do this, to actually to want to use good programming, to want to collect good data, to want to improve outcomes. I think those help contribute to it. But look, we've done some great things. I mean, we've gone from 3,600 kids who were locked up in the mid-1990s to under 500 in our state facilities today, which is significant. At the same time, we've gone from about 11 state correctional facilities to 3 today. We have no girls locked up in state correctional facilities anymore, which is remarkable. We contract with a couple of local providers, so that's huge. And I want to commend, our Director Reed and his team who've helped make that happen. But at the same time, we went from 1 community correctional facility to now we have 12. And so we have to be mindful of sort of what that placement looks like. And so one of the ways our state has worked with our community correctional facilities is to build in evidence-based practice. So they did a conversion project as part of their plan to bring CBT, community cognitive behavioral therapy, into our CCFs to really try and build better outcomes for kids in those facilities. So even where you have kids in secure facilities, we can use some of the lessons learned in our community-based work to inform that. The last thing I want to say is around this diversion. I'm very excited about the fact that the competitive reclaim work also is really focused on diverting kids from deeper entry in the system or keeping them out of the system together. Some of it includes school-based kinds of efforts, school, mental health, collaborations and partnerships, work with law enforcement to really try and keep kids out of the system entirely. And I'm pleased to hear that our Department of Youth Services is now really looking to move their JDAI work. We have state JDAI to really try and incentivize, again, counties that have detention centers that want to look at diversion. What are the lessons we've learned in JDAI and our state facilities that we can bring to our local juvenile detention centers and make improvements both in our centers but also in our diversion efforts. So I think those are places that we want to continue to move to.
And I was going to ask either Dr. or Judge, if one of you wanted to weigh in on just the sustainability, give us kind of the parting wisdom as we're getting ready to close the panel down. What's going to sustain, like as folks are thinking about, again, looking to the long haul?
Very quickly, pick your champions well. You have to have them because state leadership turns over constantly. And as soon as you feel like you've made that forward momentum, the legislative turnover, judges turnover, DAs turnover, so you have to have some champion that's going to sustain this effort for the long haul.
It's a collaborative process, but I'm glad to hear Ohio focusing on education. I'll leave you with this. I've spent a lot of time on criminal justice reform. Many of you all have as well. If we focus our sole attention on the 4 corners of the criminal justice system, we are missing the opportunity to address the problem. The problem is before the criminal justice system gets involved. And so the school system and school discipline, which is where I think Georgia is going next, is really the key. It's the faucet that's filling up this juvenile justice tub, and we've really got to get outside the criminal justice system to positively affect the criminal justice system. And I just ask you to keep that in mind as you develop policies. They're not all going to be within the criminal justice system per se.
Well, Well, and with that, I want to thank all of you for spending a little time up here talking about this work. For those of you who are curious about any of the initiatives that we were discussing up here on stage, it's included on your flash drive. So you'll see descriptions of all the work that's been going on in these states. Obviously, use your app, and you can also find and connect with these folks up on stage. But thank you all. It is a late afternoon. I appreciate your attention. Thanks.
Juvenile Justice Program at the Council of State Governments Justice Center. Very quickly, I've got 3 jobs to do. The first is I'm going to share the polling results of the polling questions we asked you earlier today. The second is I'm going to welcome Tom Stickrath up to the stage to do a brief closeout. And the third is I'm going to move as quickly as possible because we've got an open bar reception that I know you all want to get to. Polling questions. We asked you, and this is really the focus of this forum, we asked you, do you have a statewide plan in place to reduce recidivism and improve outcomes for youth? 22% of you said you do in fact have a state plan, which is great because Administrator Listenby announced a significant funding initiative if your plan meets key criteria for you to actually get funding to effectively implement that plan. Almost 70% of you, though, said you do not have a plan in place. And that really reinforces the importance of this forum and the importance of why you're here today, as well as the opportunity for you to leverage a variety of technical assistance to really help you develop that plan. The third polling question was, do you involve young people in your state juvenile justice policies and practices? Only about 3% of you say you always involve youth. In contrast, 34% say you involve youth some of the time. Almost 45% say you do not efficiently involve youth. And about 6% say you never involve young people. The single best way to figure out how to improve outcomes for youth in the juvenile justice system is to ask youth in the juvenile justice system. And so these polling results really just a reminder to all of us to really focus on engaging and involving young people in those decisions. We've asked Tom Stickrath, who's the superintendent for the Bureau of Criminal Justice Investigation in the Attorney General's office in Ohio, to really just help us do a quick wrap-up. But before I welcome Tom to the stage, we wanted to use this really special opportunity to say a few words in his honor. As many of you know, Tom has held just about every leadership position in a justice organization in the state of Ohio. And that's not because he was fired from them, but that's because he did such a great job leading them. Some of you may not know that Tom is also the most recent chair of the board of directors of the Council of State Governments Justice Center. What's kind of amazing to think about is 2.5 years ago, the Justice Center did not have a juvenile justice program at all. Really, the Justice Center was doing primarily criminal justice work. One of the roles that Tom had was director of the Ohio Department of Youth Services, which oversees juvenile corrections in Ohio. And it's really Tom's leadership and Tom's insistence that the Justice Center not only focus on criminal justice, but focus on issues of juvenile justice, to do that in collaboration with state leaders, to do that in collaboration with many of the national associations that are gathered here today, and to push states not just to focus on incarceration rates, but to focus on how do you really reduce recidivism and improve the lives of youth who come into the contact with the system, that we have a juvenile justice program. And no small measure that I have a job today. So it's really all credit to Tom that we have a juvenile justice program and that we're really gathered here today for this amazing forum. And so Tom, on behalf of myself, on behalf of our juvenile justice team, on behalf of the entire Council of State Governments Justice Center in the field, we want to thank you for your commitment to improving outcomes for youth. We've got small tributes to you.
I'm the greatest fan of the Ohio State University. Congratulations on a great run.
Tom, you've always been a great ambassador for doing public safety right. Data-driven, consensus-focused, and always looking to bring people together. That's a remarkable, unique skill, and because of it, you've made a difference.
So Tom, thanks a lot for raising the bar for me. It made my job a lot more difficult, but I think I speak for everyone who works at the Justice Center saying thank you for the leadership.
If I had to describe you in 3 words, I would say
steadiness.
You've been a steady presence for all these years.
Steady, deep, and humorous. Tom's the type of person who's a real straight shooter, and there's no BS with Tom. And I think that's why people listen to him.
You probably don't think of yourself as a mystery man, but I do. There are a lot of things that you do, and I don't know how you do them. I don't know how you keep your temper. I don't know how you stay calm. I don't know how you do such a good job at everything you do. I don't even know if you're a Republican or a Democrat after all these years.
Tom, your experience on boards, commissions around the country are certainly very prestigious, but they also have a very practical application for us, and that is that you can take what you learned on them, take what you've learned from other people, and bring that back and use it in the state of Ohio for the benefit of Ohio taxpayers.
So Tom, the thing I remember the most is your leadership on juvenile justice stuff in Ohio and how you kind of set a standard for the rest of the country, certainly for us in Connecticut. And I think you've demonstrated that you can get great outcomes and have a lot fewer kids locked up and have a lot less crime. And that's something we all strive for.
Behind the scenes at the Justice Center, it really took a great deal of work on your behalf, Tom, to rally the board of directors as well as the staff around seeing youth and juvenile issues as core and central to the Justice Center's mission.
You have brought to light the critical issues that are facing the system and the young people and families that are being impacted by the system. You bring the conversation to where it needs to be brought, and we really appreciate your transparency, your commitment, and your generosity.
The breadth of his knowledge is exceeded only by the depth of his dedication to this cause. We're all better for his service and his friendship. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you. That was rather surprising and a little embarrassing, actually. But I'm supposed to have a panel up here. Mark, what is? Do we have a panel? Or did they all go to the open bar? Well, thank you for that. That was a very nice tribute and a completely unexpected and way too flattering. But thank you so much. But we did want to close out, and Josh did give me 2 instructions. One was to be very brief, so panel will be brief, right? And 2 was to remind you about the open bar at 5:30, which he already did. So, as the immediate past chair of the board, let me join Michael Lawler, our illustrious chair, and the other board members. We had a great turnout of board members at this forum, and let me join all of them. And again, thanking all of you for participating in this very significant event. Wow, what a day it's been. I hope you have found all these sessions to be as informative and inspirational as I have. It's just been wonderful as a Justice Center board member for a long time and former Youth Services Director. Like you, I'm very passionate about these issues, and I'm just thrilled that we've been able to pull together the resources and merge so much of so many individuals, the bully pulpit of so many great organizations as we work together to improve outcomes for youth involved with the juvenile justice system. And let me especially thank Mike Thompson, because that's where so much of the credit goes certainly for the work we're doing in juvenile justice at the Justice Center and for this forum. Mike has a real vision in bringing us together and for asking those right questions, in pushing the envelope and really challenging us to be more strategic in looking at youth outcomes. You know, during my 5.5 years as director of the Ohio Department of Youth Services, we reduced the number of youth in confinement by over half, as Gabriella noted, and Harvey Reid has certainly carried that forward in great fashion. And I was quite proud of that, as many of you are in your states. And I would, kind of pump my chest and say, look what we did. But then we began having focus groups of leaders from across the country, researchers, practitioners, many of whom I see in the room today as I looked around earlier, Shea Bilchek and Susan Burke, Candace Jones, Ned Longren, and others, that we would ask ourselves these questions. Actually, Mike Thompson would ask us these questions. He'd say, yes, you reduced your population, but where are these kids? And what are their outcomes? And as we look around at those focus groups, we said we have a lot more work to do, a lot of hard work yet to be done, and that's why you're all here today. But I think our key takeaways, my key takeaways from today are really 3 fairly simple takeaways. One, as we've seen unequivocally, states have dramatically reduced juvenile incarceration rates. 2, we have made far less progress in reducing recidivism and improving other outcomes for youth arrested and in contact with the justice system. And 3, every state should have a comprehensive statewide plan to improve outcomes for youth under supervision of the state and local juvenile justice systems that meet key criteria. So tomorrow, in your teams, you will begin the process of determining what steps are needed to develop or enhance an existing statewide plan to improve outcomes for youth in your states. And the MacArthur Foundation has provided great support in this endeavor with the development of these centers, the resource centers that can provide states with support and technical assistance on issues that are critical to improving outcomes for youth. And now, with our panel here, we want to give you just a quick overview of these resource centers in advance of tomorrow's breakout sessions. And let me briefly introduce our 4 presenters who will give overviews of their respective centers. Kathy Skowra, Associate Director of the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice. Kim Borchak, Director of the National Juvenile Defender Center. John Toole, Director of the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice. And Crystal Larson, Director of the Center on Youth Justice with the Vera Institute of Justice. So we'll just go right down the line if we could, or it looks like you have the mic.
I'll start.
So
Thank you, Tom. Hello, everyone. I'll be very brief. I know it's been a long day. My name is Kathy Skowra. I'm with the National Center for Mental Health and Juvenile Justice, and yes, we operate one of the 4 MacArthur Foundation-funded resource centers. Ours is focused on mental health. It's called the Mental Health and Juvenile Justice Collaborative for Change. Our mission is to promote and actively support the dissemination of the mental health innovations that came out of the states that were involved with Models for Change and that came out of the states that were involved with the Models for Change Mental Health Juvenile Justice Action Network that Lori Garducki mentioned this morning in her remarks. Mental health was a major focus of the states and the sites that were involved with Models for Change. So I'm intending to use the workshop tomorrow morning to focus on this work and kind of share some of the best work that came out of this effort. I'll start by talking about what we consider to be the 6 most important considerations, essential elements, whatever it is you want to call it, issues that should be addressed or included in any kind of state juvenile justice reform plan that includes some sort of behavioral health or mental health component. And these issues will all be familiar to folks. We talked a lot about them today: interagency collaboration, standardized screening and assessment, diversion, access to effective treatment, family involvement, and workforce development. So after I talk a bit about each of these issues, I want to link them directly to some of the very specific work that came out of Models for Change. provide you with program examples. For example, some of the school and probation-based diversion models that came out of the Action Network that focus specifically on youth with mental health and substance use disorders. I want to talk about some of the training resources that were developed through this effort that focus specifically on training law enforcement, training school resource officers, training staff who work in juvenile justice settings on adolescent mental health and mental health treatment and disorders. And finally, we have a lot of new how-to guides and resources and a whole variety of information that came out of this effort that linked those essential elements that hopefully will provide you with some guidance, perhaps inspiration, or at least just generally inform your thinking about how you might want to go about addressing mental health and behavioral health in your plan. And finally, I want to talk a little bit about our resource center and the issues that we focus on and the types of assistance that we offer and who our partners are in this effort. And I hope at the end of all of that to have some time at the end for comments, questions, discussion. I'd like to learn about some of the work that's going on in your states and how you're thinking about approaching this issue as you put your plans together. So that's it. Thank you.
Good. Thanks, Kathy.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Toole. I'm currently serving as the Executive Director for the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice. Our center, launched 2 years ago, is one of the 4 national resource centers that has been funded and supported by the MacArthur Foundation to continue the legacy of the work that was started with the Models for Change, which you've heard so much about. Our focus, and what you'll hear about tomorrow in the session that I'll be presenting, will be around the issue of dual status youth. That is an initiative that was first garnered recognition by the MacArthur Foundation in the year 2000, really to raise the awareness of the understanding between maltreatment and delinquency. And MacArthur has continuously funded our efforts for the past 15 years, and it's given us the opportunity to develop a framework, guiding publications, toolkits, and outstanding partnerships throughout the country with jurisdictions that have used that framework to produce real reforms around these most challenged, troubling, and disadvantaged youth. So I'll be talking about that framework, highlighting some of the successes that we've experienced over the past 15 years conducting this work, and hoping to hear some of your perspectives on the challenges that jurisdictions face when they want to encounter this population. Additionally, during our Models for Change experience, we were able to launch a framework that surrounded the issue of probation system reform as well. And for the past decade, we've had the opportunity to use that framework to work with jurisdictions in the field to launch an exhaustive analysis of their current practices within their probation department and their relationships with the court and the relationships with their providers and their community in bringing about the best possible outcomes for those youth. So I will have a chance also during tomorrow's session to lay out that framework, the experienced success that we've had, some of the really remarkable outcomes that have been achieved in both of those arenas of our work. And I look forward to the opportunity to meet you tomorrow, hear your perspectives, certainly answer your questions, and make a connection with you as I have with many over the past decade, 10, 15 years, that are already in the audience today. So that will be the RFK National Resource Center session, and I look forward to seeing you.
Thanks, John.
Good evening. My name is Krista Larson. I'm the director of the Center on Youth Justice at the Vera Institute of Justice, and with support from the MacArthur Foundation, we've operated the Status Offense Reform Center for the past almost 2 years now. Similar to what Kathy and John just described, the focus of the Reform Center is partly an online resource where we collate information about status offenses, as well as best practices from across the country, many of which are drawn out of the Models for Change initiatives in the core states, as well as other locations, about what really works so that practitioners and others can hear from peers about what they've done in their jurisdictions. Because if we take a public safety perspective, status offenses really seem like a place where we can see some real wins, where we're not worried that public safety will be at risk with these young people. Because we know, as we heard earlier today, that these low-level offenses really don't benefit from the full force of the justice system, and we know that this is true even when the party that's requesting a forceful response is that young person's parent. So what we're, and that That said, even though this can be a place where there can be some obvious wins, I think those of you who may have shifted a bit in your seat at the mere mention of status offenses know that this can be a challenging population. There's lots of different underlying factors that relate to how young people come to the attention of the justice system for these kinds of behaviors, and challenges associated with what the right response can be. Unfortunately, what we've seen is jurisdictions that have really paved the way with what works. And so I really liked the frame from the previous panel, where tomorrow we're going to be talking a little bit about what's possible, but also about what's hard and what's already been done.
Good afternoon. My name is Kim Dvorak, and I am the new Executive Director of the National Juvenile Defender Center, having taken over for Patty Puritz just this August. And I want to thank very much the Justice Center and the MacArthur Foundation, as well as OJJDP, for highlighting the role of juvenile defenders. I think as we all look toward new and innovative ideas to improve outcomes for youth, we can't overlook the basics. And for a child, access to justice requires, at its core, access to counsel. It is not only a constitutional mandate, but it is an integral component of a developmentally informed juvenile justice system. Yet, vast numbers of children across this country are entering into plea agreements without consultation with counsel, sometimes for sentences of incarceration, and without an understanding of the lifelong consequences of a juvenile adjudication. I want all of you to know that the National Juvenile Defender Center is eager to work with all branches of government to help improve juvenile defense delivery systems, both on the state and local level. And tomorrow I will be talking about the role of defense counsel, principles of an effective juvenile defense system, and how your state can get ready for the 50th anniversary of the In re Galt decision, which we will commemorate in May of 2017. There's information in your packet as well as on your flash drive about training and technical assistance that the National Juvenile Defender Center can provide to you. And I hope that all of you will send one member of your team to meet with me tomorrow to ensure that your statewide plan includes effective representation for all children. Thank you.
Thank you. John, did you have something you wanted to add? Or did I just embarrass you?
What a lovely position to be put in when there's a little postscript when the beer and the wine and the beverages are waiting for you. But I was reminded, amazingly, that we also have done a body of work, and particularly for those in the audience, around the issues overcoming information sharing, the protection of confidentiality and privacy provisions, as well as ways in which we might lawfully, properly, disclose information in a collaborative environment that might lend itself towards a better solution, a better treatment and case plan for these kids that leads to improved opportunities for outcomes. I don't know how I forgot that during my commentary, but I was reminded that I should remind you, and we will be talking about that just a little bit tomorrow as well. Also, I would say, since I've been given this, that to you Bama fans and to you Tigers and all you other people, I'm a Maryland fan, and I'm jealous and envious of you all the time. But I would remind you that Friday night tips off basketball season, and you all are looking up at us once that season starts.
What conference are they in now, John? I don't know. Anyway. All right.
The Big Ten.
Thanks again to our panelists. I think, as you heard, and you'll hear so much more tomorrow and in the weeks and months to come, there's tremendous capacity and a tremendous knowledge base with these resource centers. So they are here to assist us and to assist you, and we look forward to a great day tomorrow. So again, the reception this evening at 5:30. It's, I think, one floor down by the landmark room outdoors, and we look forward to seeing you there. Thanks for a great day.